G'day legends, I hope you're having a fantastic day and a brilliant Friday leading into what I hope is a fantastic weekend. Now legends, I was up very late doing some work to fit in with the US time zone, so I am actually extremely tired today because I had a doctor's appointment early this morning which I had forgotten about. But let's get stuck into it. We, as always, do have a lot to go over. We're going to, of course, look at Pokrovsk, look at different sources, look at what is unfolding there, and look at what battle history tells us about retreat and the costs that, of course, come with this. So we'll give a full update on Pokrovsk. We'll start, though, with Kupiansk and other maps and a localized collapse in Kupiansk. Of course, Kupiansk is the sort of forgotten Pokrovsk at the moment. We'll talk about Europe's funding to Ukraine. There is a huge funding gap at the moment. This year cost over $100 billion to Ukraine. What we know is Trump, he's not sending any more money. He's relying on Europe buying American arms for this. There's a huge shortfall in this money. We know there's a lot of Russian frozen assets, but even that, if it was fully taken, won't actually meet the shortfalls. And that is being at least pegged to be used to rebuild in reparations following the war. And I love when European states speak about reparations. We'll speak about that, though. We'll see what could be done in this. We'll speak about manpower. I harp on this again and again and again. It's actually, I guess, refreshing in a way to see a lot of people have come to the dark side and said, yeah, look, manpower is actually a problem. Maybe we should mobilise. Thing is, if you mobilise now, you're talking end of 26, beginning of 27. Best case, Zelensky was correct in 23 when he said, because we'd see the effect of that in the battlefield at the moment. So we do have a lot to go over, but it's going to be a little bit scattered. Apologies. Let's start with this. Overnight, there was a very large Russian air attack again against Ukraine, against mostly energy facilities with rolling blackouts. 60-ish missiles, I believe, and around 700 drones, I believe. I think it was maybe 600 all up, 700 aerial targets. Around that, that's not what we're speaking about. Fighter posted this. There are no questions about the number of missiles. It's roughly equal to the average number, blah, blah, blah. The lack of increase in the number of drones used is unclear because judging by the estimates, we have long producing more than 1,000 long-range drones per day, but we use significantly fewer. Either we're stockpiling, repaying a debt to someone with them, or physically cannot launch more. It's unclear. And this is actually very surprising. It has been for some time reported through many different channels that Russia can produce around 1,000 of these Garand-style drones a day, being different variants of them. But we're not seeing that many. So what is the case? And this is, are they stockpiling for their all-out massive attack? Is it just the launching platforms to get those in the air? Or are some going to where may have been used previously? Interesting to look at. I think we'll see, and as we have seen, a steady increase in those numbers and more just day after day after day to increase that pressure on the Ukrainian energy grid as well, especially as it then cools down. Let's have a look at the maps. Here is Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital Kyiv, red areas, occupied since 22, purple since 2014, red check, blue check, Russia, Ukrainian gains over the past 24 hours. Let's come down into Kupiansk. No changes shown on this map. I don't believe in grey zone either, if I'm correct. Doesn't show any grey zone shift when I go back and forward on a day. Syriac mapping, though, he is saying this. And as you can see, straight off the bat, this is significantly different. So what we're looking for is these two dog legs in the road. So we come down and we're talking right down into this area here that he's saying the Russians have pushed down to the south, also with a smaller push, but on the eastern side of the Oskil. Due to weeks of fire control of supply lines, which led to the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops, much of the southwest districts, including into these micro districts. So he's calling this a localized collapse. Moreover, in recent days, Russian troops also managed to cross the Oskil and enter the eastern part of Kupiansk via this street and the dairy factory. So keep an eye on Kupiansk. It is highly ignored, but this is incredibly important also. And I say to people, it's very obvious to see a regional hubs in. Just zoom in, and if you see several roads and railways and everything heading out of it, get a pretty good idea of this. Okay, where else are we looking? Let's go up into the north. We have a lot today up in the north. We'll go then firstly into the northeastern sector just above just above Kupiansk in here. And we see this during the last 4 days. Russian army continued advances out of Melovsky axis, reaching the northern outskirts of Abane village. In addition, Dorichnia, Russian forces managed to recapture the locality of Fyholivkia. Fyholivkia is somewhere you and I have spoken about for some time. This sits down in this sector right here. Again, the labelling can be... Fyholivkia sits right in here. I was too zoomed in. So he's saying this area's come back under control of Russian forces, and there's been more pushing in the direction of Ambane as well. We have seen an increase in that grey zone, and that has been telling us that this area has been shifting. Come into Sumy, of course, where Ukraine crossed into Kursk. Now the Russians are back into Sumy, and we do have a Syriac map update in here. In the last 5 days, Ukrainian army managed to recapture a series of positions along the international border and north of Kivka, managed to recapture half of Konstantinivka. Again, let's have a look in here. This area, half under control, Kivka back under control, and then along where the international border is. Okay, but where everyone's waiting for is, of course, Pokrovsk. So let's just have a look on the northern side. Deep state map saying Ukraine is pushing further and further east towards Shakhovka, Russia pushing to the north in the direction of Shakhovka as well. Again, the northern area here has been a mess to report over the past couple of months. But the big story is the Pokrovsk pocket. Of course, we see the grey zone heading to the outskirts of Pokrovsk to the north, and also just then a few kilometres from here, I believe about 3 kilometres at best 2.7 near Krasny Man. We've spoken about then the vertical envelopment of this area and how this is deteriorating in here today. You do see further red check pushing into this sector. Now, what I will say on this area is there's very differing opinions between a lot of people. Of course, you'll see people like Mr. David D say that it looks vastly different to this. It's not going to fall. Special forces are going in to be recaptured. And of course, many have different reads on this situation. Again, I've reached out to many online voices again this morning who share differing opinions, willing to share my platform with them to share those, as I always do in open interviews, no gotcha moments, no nothing, to try and get as many different ideas on what is happening in this sector. Again, as you know, or as you may know, I reach out to a hell of a lot of people on both sides of this conflict in the blogger space, informational space, analyst space. The amount I hear back from is incredibly limited, but the invitation is still open. So let's have a look in here. Let's look at what this Ukrainian officer says. Everyone is shouting about Pokrovsk, but the problem in the city is only that we do not have full control over it and risk losing it in the future, which is not the worst thing. Because the biggest problem in the situation is the people and units that are at the bottom of this bag between Pokrovsk and Minograd, even to the south and southeast of it. Something you and I have been saying for some time. It's not Pokrovsk, it's Minograd and down near Krasny Yar. This is the problem of how the hell are these troops going to get out, even if there is a withdrawal order. How is that going to take place? And here it's not simply just problematic logistics or something else, simply the question of possibility of withdraw and carry out these manoeuvres. I might say something unpopular for Ukrainians, but I would sacrifice the ruins of Pokrovsk to save the lives of all those people. But judging by the operational tactical situation, we will come to the option of losing the city sooner or later. But whether we will save the people until that moment, and if so, how many, the question remains open. And what I will say from my read online is that a lot of these online bloggers who preach and chant and shout about that they want the best future for Ukrainians and the UAF, that they are not willing to sacrifice the ruins of Pokrovsk for the lives in the south and the east. And I always say, regardless of what maps we show, I'm always on the side of the boys actually doing the fighting. Now, let's have a look at this. This is Mr. Serhiy Stanenko, one of the most unapologetically pro-Ukrainian voices. Let's have a look at what he is saying about this. Avdiivka, Ugledar, Suja. Not in each of these cases, the enemy, they cut off our logistics and the units found themselves in a fire stack. Every time our forces withdrew at the last moment with heavy losses, abandoning property and equipment. Not everyone could get out. Some remained in their positions forever. This is happening again right now. And of course, we saw what happened in Avdiivka. And Mr. AMK Mapping, he is sharing this today as well, talking about Avdiivka and the similarities of what we saw unfold in this sector. Ukrainian soldiers still stationed and effectively encircled at the bottom of the Pokrovsk, Lysivka, Suky Yar remind me of those who were encircled in the industrial zones outside Avdiivka. Neither time were they given the order to withdraw in time, even though there were weeks of opportunities to do so. And I remember that lead up to Avdiivka, we're going, what is going on? We can see this closing. He says the Ukrainian command does not care about these soldiers and is happy to use them as to delay the collapse of PR cities for propaganda purpose. It's absolutely disgusting. You should wake up call for all those who think otherwise. And I will say there's a hell of a lot who will, for their own vanity, then sacrifice those of which they claim to support so strongly. But Mr. Stanenko, he points out this, and I didn't know he had this sort of game, talking about, of course, Karl von Clauswitz, who, of course, will be then overtaken by Ursula von der Leyen, I'm sure, in history of tactical strategic warfare. But he says this, and this is very true. Yesterday I spoke about the battle sequence and that the entire battle sequence, that's the casualties you need to look at. Not just the break-in, not just the artillery, the entire battle sequence, including the withdrawal. And that's when you have a huge amount of cost. From experience, it is known that the difference between losses on the part of the victor and on the part of the vanquished is rarely great. And the greater part of the losses the vanquished sustains during the retreat. The pitiful remnants of battalions are cut down by cavalry, exhausted men fall behind, damaged guns, shattered ammunition wagons are abandoned. The rest cannot be evacuated quickly enough due to the poor condition of the roads, and they will be captured by the pursuing troops. At night, individual columns will stray from the path and defenceless fall into captivity. Again, Karl von Clauswitz is still taught at every war college around the world. Also, he is pre-age of drones, night fighting equipment. Although what I say is these new weapons, it doesn't change the theory of war. What it does is actually reinforce these theories of war even more, of envelopment, withdrawal, of attrition, all of these doctrines and protraction also. Very interesting to see Mr. Stanko point that out. Of course, massively finger on the pulse to do with areas like this. Let's look at what we spoke about yesterday about a physical encirclement of this. We saw what Suryak Maps spoke about, and a guy behind the scenes who helps me out, he actually disagrees with this, and we're more than happy always to share disagreeable opinions, whether it was with me or someone I share. I see this as like what we do here is like an academic continual discussion and learning. More importantly, I'm not convinced by Suryak's argument regarding encirclements. I think he's right about Mariupol, but the situation was very different. The Russians had very limited numbers. They were apparently trying to end the war quickly by pressuring on Kiev. So they needed to take care of Mariupol as soon as possible. They probably hadn't accepted that this was going to be a war of attrition yet. It was still very early days of the war, and I agree that it was about trying to end the war quickly, then have a pressure on Kiev to have some sort of negotiated settlement, overthrow. However, it is a different war then to now. That is very true. If they wanted the special military operation to be over quickly, it was somehow logical to try and clear Mariupol fast, hence the losses they were willing to take. But I don't think any of this applies now. If they could completely encircle Pokrovsk or any other big city, it would be a big win for them. Sure, the siege will require a large amount of troops that might be useful elsewhere, but they could just stop fighting and wait for the Ukrainians to surrender or starve. Also in this, if they did get that, the amount of diplomatic pull that would then have to someone like Trump would be massive. So no, Russian forces from that point on and massive losses on the Ukrainian side. So if it is actually surrounded, but of course there's going to be attempts to break through that also. And if that means making slower progress on the other part of the front line, so be it. It's going to be slow anyway. And now they have sufficient numbers to besiege a large city while keeping the pressure up in other areas, even if to a lesser extent than it would a siege. But I think, again, I don't think in the modern age of drones, this runs in between these two, I don't think you need a full physical encirclement like some are expecting with fire control on it. But it does appear that they are going somewhat for a full physical envelopment of Minograd, Sukhry Yar, Lysivka area. So it's just going to be very interesting to see what happens. Again, I'm not saying drones can then cover for infantry or fortifications. No, that is not the case. Infantry are the ones that seize and hold terrain. But if you have 1 or 2 roads out of here, you can set up repeaters and all this. It can be a bloody nightmare. He continues on this, and this is something interesting about attritional war. In my opinions, the reason they're not completely encircling Pokrovsk might be, 1, Ukraine keeps pouring troops into the area, which favours attrition. You and I have spoken about this before in other sectors. They're really trying to, they just haven't succeeded yet. So it could be, of course, a mix of both also. So let's have a look at this talk about ceasefire in Pokrovsk as well. I got messaged by a friend of mine last night going, what's your take on this? And I said, oh, look, let me think about it. And realistically, it's looking for an informational propaganda victory due to the demoralisation of forces that would be in there. The Ministry of Defence of the Russian Federation has received an order from the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Federation to ensure unhindered passage for foreign journalists, including Ukrainian ones, upon coordination with the command of the Ukrainian armed forces, to visit areas where Ukrainian troops are blockaded in then Pokrovsk, Minograd, Kupiansk. So what they're wanting is unimpeded access from journalists, Western Ukrainian, into Minograd, Pokrovsk, and Kupiansk, of course, where there is encirclement in here, and the situation, at least from my read, I know other people are saying the situation's going brilliantly and that there's a zillion Russians dying in here, 2 zillion after the last zillion last week, but that they can go in to conduct interviews, reporting, whatever. Again, I see this as part of the informational aspect because we'd be very demoralised in there. The Russian command is prepared, if necessary, to cease hostilities for 5 or 6 hours in these areas and to provide corridors for the unhindered entry and exit of groups of foreign media representatives, including Ukrainian ones, provided that security guarantees are in place for journalists and servicemen. So a pause of hostilities, let journalists go in. A spokesman for the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they do not want to let this happen. He says, frankly, I do not recommend that any reporters trust any of Putin's proposals for corridors. Putin's only goal is to prolong the war, and he's never kept any of his ceasefire pledges. Again, we have actually seen some ceasefires in here, but prolonging the war, when we talk about sanctions, we can get into the paradox of this. But this here, also remind the media, any visits to the Russian-occupied territory without Ukraine's permission are a violation of our legislation and international law. More of Ukraine's legislation than international law. They will have long-term reputational and legal consequences. We are watching closely. Now, again, there are absolutely bloggers who go to occupied territories to then reinforce propaganda narratives and this and that. But saying that reporting, if it is legitimate, can't be done in areas, I think is a silly breakdown of then free media. Like when I was in Idlib in Syria, the people running the show there, I don't agree with them at all. But and I can see why Ukraine do not want journalists reporting and talking to people exactly what is actually occurring down into this sector. And I can see why the Russians may want that. And of course, we know both Ukraine and Russia have a huge control over the media and journalists and what people see and where they see it. Okay, so I said yesterday we'll talk about then China and Trump, Xi, Putin, talking about deals and rare earths. There's a reprieve due to Xi's sanctions on the fentanyl trade. That's dropped from 20% to 10%. So the tariff is down to 47% from 57%. There's a pause on the rare earth export curbs for another year. Global markets shrug off hotly anticipated meats. And this actually should be of concern. Global markets recently, over the past couple of years, they're just not responding at all to like massive news, whether it be war, it's bombing, it's all of this. There's just no real market response to this. And I think this is a lot of what we're seeing in maybe the over-capitalization of a lot of these markets, the overvaluation of a lot of these markets, and how I think people believe it can't have a pullback. Again, I think we will see. Sorry, I didn't finish actually the mapping before we go into this. On the Velika front, in the direction of Huliapol, we do see an advancement here by the Russian forces of some 3.8 kilometres, close enough to 4 kilometres. Again, the nightmare for the linear warfare bros in that direction. Right, Funding for Ukraine, of course, a hotly debated topic for years. The Economist, why funding for Ukraine is a giant opportunity for Europe. This will be interesting. Wars are fought on the battlefield, but they're also trials of financial strength. At the end of the day, attritional protracted war is a trial of strength of the nation, economically, the people, and your allies. The truth is about to become all too real for Europe. Ukraine is facing a savage cash crunch. Unless something changes, it will run out of money at the end of February. It is November. This is coming around awfully quick. This cliff edge is fast approaching now that Trump has cut America's financial support for Ukraine. Indebted, fractious Europe needs to find the money to keep Ukraine in the fight. But it would be a terrible mistake to see this cash as merely a painful exercise in annual budgeting. Instead, a historic opportunity to shift the balance of power between Europe and Russia by exposing the Kremlin's financial frailty and altering Putin's calculus about war and peace. So saying if you pour in this, the calculation that Putin is having that he will be victorious on the battlefield, that you can shift this. It is also a chance to speed up Europe's efforts to establish its military and financial interdependence from America. The bill for Ukraine is higher than most Europeans realise, but they're saying it's also a bargain. And they, of course, this sovereignty away from America, which again, buying American equipment, being reliant on American equipment for your military, for trade, and for energy, they're the three pillars of sovereignty and independence. So no, sorry, that's not actually what is going to be happening. But the main points in this is the total war cost this year will reach $360 billion. This year is 100 to 110 billion. Ukraine's public debt is now 110% of their GDP, so it can't borrow more money. The EU has failed to agree on a 163 billion loan using Russian assets because of opposition. And of course, many very concerned about what that looks like if they're left holding the bag, because highly likely they would lose any legal appeals, even at home, against these assets. We saw Belgian PM, I believe, saying that we didn't even do this in the Second World War. Now, who ran the central banks, I'm guessing. But there are worries as well that any blank checks just going in will face huge corruption. Also, this is the points this article is making. They argue that Europe could weaken Russia financially by committing to fund Ukraine for several years. It also mentions Russia can fight for a number of years economically, but if we commit to this, we will further weaken Russia. This is where it's getting into, that this is a bargain. So you know who it's a bargain for? You're talking about a bargain for the taxpayer. You know who it's not a bargain for? The Ukrainians, of which you are giving, that you want to give money and weapons to go and fight. It's not a bargain for those being dragged off the street to go and die in Pokrovsk. Okay? It's not a bargain for that. You're talking about a bargain, yeah, maybe financially, to weaken your greatest enemy, your adversary is Russia. It's not a bargain for the ones actually doing the job, guys. What it proposes is a 4-year, $390 billion European commitment. It says this newspaper supports the seizure of Russian assets. Firstly, I think it's interesting when you see a paper saying stuff like that, especially I haven't seen any economist anywhere who actually they may support ideologically, morally, the seizure of these assets, but economically are going, this is a nightmare. Anyway, but they are still 230 billion short of what is needed. So even if that occurs, still massively short. Given the size of the challenge, Europe collectively faces some sort of joint borrowing that it must be justified, far from undermining the euro's international status for the EU to issue bonds collectively, and would create a bigger pool of common debt. So bigger pool of debt, issue bonds, and that it wouldn't undermine the euro's international status. I would question that of sovereign assets being taken, because that is the concern of all economists and a lot of leaders. Deepening Europe's single capital market and boosting the role of the euro as a reserve currency. I don't see how this at all is going to boost the euro as a reserve currency. As we're seeing, the US is reducing as a reserve currency year by year by year. We see gold skyrocketing of this. We see where China is trying to leverage the yuan. Strap in. It says, instead of shying away from financial contest with the Kremlin, Europe should embrace it and win the war. Now, this is maybe coming from an economic standpoint, but my standpoint is, okay, let's mobilize $1 trillion right now. You still need a guy on the front line to use that weapon system or be trained. It's not just a financial battle. You could mobilize $1 trillion right now and go in. It's going to take years for fighter aircraft, years for more infantry training, years for this and this and this. If it was going to be done, should have been done years ago. Of course, it faces further challenges in the future. I have said, I think Europe does not want to they don't want to then take these frozen assets. But also, I don't see that they have any other way other than that, and we'll see the consequences of that for decades down the track. But the European leaders, they have tied this war is ideologically existential for the European leaders at the moment. For them saying, however long it takes, whatever it takes, which is, of course, rhetoric. They're not acting like this. But ideologically, they've tied it existentially to this. I think we'll see seizure of those, spending of those. I think we will see it because I don't see by February where else the money's going to come from. But I think strap in for that. And if you think that's going to increase the standing of the euro in international markets, I would say strap on. Now, we see this article here. Almost 100,000 young men flee Ukraine in 2 months. 100,000 fighting-age Ukrainian men have left the country between 18 and 22. In comparison, the entire British Army is 70,000, although these are not eligible to be drafted into the military. Zelensky enacted a new rule that Ukrainian men can travel abroad when they reach 23. It was hoped that they would then return to volunteer and fight at a later date. It was hoped it would stop families from sending their teenage children overseas before their 18th birthday to avoid them being drafted in the future. And this is, as this war grows along in the tooth, you got to remember that some of these guys who could now fight were 15, 14 when the war started. But, okay, these guys can't be conscripted. So is this having a huge change right now? No, because none of these guys were volunteering anyway. But if the war continues on its current trajectory, and once then they turn into the age brackets of which they can be, or if they think about volunteering, if the war continues on its current trajectory, after years of being away, new missus, new job, kid, whatever, do you actually think that large numbers of these guys are going to return to fight? If you're looking at the current situation of the envelopment in Pokrovsk, financial worries, all of this, constant red line moving on the battlefield, do you actually think these guys are going to return to fight? Now, the Western states that these guys have fled to, they also face large demographic issues. And I know from a friend that works senior in Germany, there is very little incentive to send back these young people, especially these young Europeans. Now, it says American generals and politicians had complained that Zelensky's refusal to draft any men of fighting age was hurting Ukraine's hopes of resisting Russia's invasion and pressing home advantages. And this is true. The decision not to mobilise down at 18, conscript at that. Now, I know the pool of men at that is still pretty low, but the decision to not do that, when we've seen America do it, we know that was a big sticking point for Biden. We know it's a sticking point for Trump. We know it's a sticking point behind a lot of closed doors also, because they're talking about existential, and you're saying it's existential to conscript these guys, but there's a massive paradox in that too. Now, people come at me for wanting conscription. What I say is these people have no fucking idea where I sit on conscription and haven't watched any of my videos. I think I'm the least war-hungry YouTuber on this website. You know the funny thing? You know why? Because I've probably seen the most amount of war of many of the YouTubers on this website. But I am vehemently against conscription. I believe that all states, whether it be Ukraine to Australia to whoever, that they need to set the environment in the state of which people are willing to fight, maybe die for. Now, this is the great unknown, I think, for the West stepping into a war in the future. Young conservative men, these are the primary fighting force of a nation. But also, in the Western states, these are also the most demoralised people in the states. That's the great unknown if there was a war. I said this the other day about if there's a war and young European guys, and all the comments like, Willie, do you really think people are going to sign up? Like, people aren't signing up now in peacetime with huge cash incentives. Do you really think it's going to happen? I know I would sign up again, but it would be for my family and my friends. Ideologically, I see the shift in Australia happening massively, but I would sign up for a war again and fight and die. But again, I guess a lot of people are incredibly demoralised. That's the great unknown in the West. Is there any nationalism actually left? Or the governments of which are then in control of these states who are turning authoritarian legitimately, how passionate are the young conservative guys for protecting and dying for that government? We'll see. Now, where people get muddled up on what I say is, as much as I'm against conscription, I see strategically if Ukraine wants to continue fighting, they want to have stabilisation or better outcomes or whatever, mobilisation, conscription is the only choice. No one's volunteering. There's mass desertion off the front line. I don't agree with conscription, but if you said, what does Ukraine need right now? It's not $1 trillion, it's 500,000 men. The only way to do this at the moment, there's fuck all cash, is going to be conscription. I don't agree with it, but strategically I see why. There's a huge manpower shortage. And it doesn't matter how much money Europe does mobilise to go in, you're still going to need a guy on the back end of a rifle. That's going to continue to be the problem. That's why the war of attrition is being fought in these pockets of which we are seeing, and why it is turning more and more catastrophic, and why I say it can turn into, then retreat can turn to rout bankruptcy theory. Legends, I hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.